April 29th, 1945. Dachau, Bavaria. The iron gates swung open with a groan that had haunted 12 years of nightmares. Morning light, pale, tentative, spilled across the parade ground where women had stood for countless dawn roll calls, their bodies pressed together against the cold, their eyes fixed on mud-stained boots that decided life or death with a flick of a clipboard. But on this morning the boots were different. They were worn and dusty, laced tight on the feet of men who moved with neither the mechanical precision of the SS nor the casual cruelty that had governed every sunrise in this place. These were American soldiers, and they walked through the gates of Dachau carrying chocolate bars in their pockets and disbelief in their eyes. In the women's barracks, a long wooden structure that smelled of lye soap and unwashed bodies, and something else, something that had no name but clung to the walls like a stain. A group of female prisoners watched through cracked windows as jeeps rolled to a stop. They had learned not to hope. Hope was a luxury, a calorie expenditure they could not afford. Some had been here since 1933, arrested for the crime of existing in a world that had decided their existence was inconvenient. Communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Romani women, Jewish women, political dissidents, asocials. Labels that had stripped them of names, of histories, of the simple right to be remembered as human. They had become numbers tattooed on forearms, entries in ledgers maintained with Germanic efficiency, bodies that worked until they could work no more. And yet here were these Americans, these impossibly tall men with their strange accents and their cameras, looking at the barracks as if they had stumbled into hell itself. One soldier, a private from Nebraska whose name history would not preserve, stood frozen beside his commanding officer and vomited into the dirt. Another sat on the ground and wept openly, his rifle forgotten at his side. These were men who had fought across France, who had seen their friends cut down at Normandy and blown apart in the Ardennes, who thought they understood war's capacity for destruction. But nothing had prepared them for this. Nothing could have. The women watched. They had watched everything for 12 years. They had watched until watching became their only form of resistance, the act of remembering what was done, so that someone, someday, might bear witness. But what they were watching now made no sense. An American officer, his insignia marked him as a captain, entered the barracks slowly, removing his helmet as if entering a church. Behind him came medics carrying boxes marked with red crosses, and soldiers with crates of supplies, and the young lieutenant with a clipboard who looked barely old enough to shave. The captain spoke in halting German, his accent American thick, but his words careful, deliberate. "You are free," he said. "The war is not over, but you are free. We are Americans. We are here to help you." Silence. The kind of silence that follows years of learning that words are traps, that kindness is the prelude to cruelty, that survival means trusting nothing and no one. Then the captain did something that would lodge itself in the memory of every woman present, something so ordinary and so impossible that it fractured 12 years of accumulated trauma in a single gesture. He asked if anyone would like to write a letter home. To understand the magnitude of this moment, this simple offer that seemed to defy the architecture of the universe these women had inhabited, one must step back into the machinery of the concentration camp system, into the deliberate engineering of isolation that was perhaps as cruel as any physical torture inflicted behind barbed wire. The Nazi camp system was not merely about labor extraction or extermination. It was about erasure. Prisoners arrived at places like Dachau, Ravensbrück, or Auschwitz, and were immediately severed from the world they had known. Heads were shaved, clothing was confiscated, names were replaced with numbers, but perhaps most insidiously, communication with the outside world was strangled to nothing. Letters, when permitted at all, were restricted to a few lines, censored beyond recognition, limited to one every few months. Families often received nothing, no word, no confirmation of life or death, just the terrible silence that could mean anything or everything. For female prisoners especially, this isolation was weaponized with particular cruelty. Women arrested for political resistance, for hiding Jewish neighbors, for refusing to comply with racial laws. These women often had... It was the torture of absence, of helplessness, of love transformed into a wound that never healed. In the internal documents of the SS, this policy was stated with bureaucratic clarity. Prisoners were to be isolated from corrupting influences of the outside world. They were to be reformed through labor and discipline, their connection to their former lives severed completely. But the true purpose was simpler and darker, to ensure that when prisoners died, as most eventually did, they would die forgotten, unmourned, erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed at all. The Nazis understood that humans are storytelling creatures. We exist in the memories of others, in the letters we write, in the small confirmations that our lives have meaning beyond our own skin. Strip that away, and you strip away something more fundamental than freedom. You strip away the evidence of having lived at all. The women in that Dachau barracks on April 29, 1945, had been living in that erasure for years. Some had not written to their families since 1938. Others had written dutifully, their letters returned unopened or never returned at all, disappearing into the bureaucratic void that surrounded the camps like a moat. They had learned to treat memory itself as contraband, something to be hidden, protected, because the guards would take even that if they discovered it. They whispered names of children to themselves at night like prayers. They traced the faces of husbands on the inside of their eyelids. They held on to the past with the same desperate strength they used to hold on to life. And now this American captain was offering them paper and ink, and the impossible promise that the words they wrote would actually reach the people they loved. The first woman to step forward was Polish. Her name was Zofia, though by this point she answered only to her prisoner number. Her name had been beaten out of her in the early days, when she still believed that dignity could be defended with words. She was 38 years old, but looked 60. Her hair, growing back in uneven patches after years of being shaved, was completely white. Her hands shook as she accepted the paper and pen the lieutenant offered her, not from weakness, though she was weak, but from the sheer impossibility. Others sat frozen, as if waiting for the trick to reveal itself, for the guard to appear and laugh at their stupidity for believing, even for a moment, that this could be real. Sophia put pen to paper. Her hand moved slowly, forming letters in Polish, words she had not written in 7 years. My dearest Anya, it is your mother. I am alive. I do not know if you will believe this letter, or if you will even receive it, but the Americans have come, and they say I can write to you. I have so much to tell you that I do not know where to begin. You will be 14 now. I have missed 7 of your birthdays. I have thought of you every single day. I have thought of you every single hour. You are the reason I am still breathing. She stopped, the pen trembling above the page. How could she describe what these years had been? How could she explain to her daughter, her child, who had been 7 years old the last time they touched, the things she had witnessed, the things that had been done to her, the slow, grinding erosion of everything except the small kernel of self she had protected by thinking of Anya's face? She could not. So she wrote instead about the Americans, about the chocolate one of them had pressed into her hand, about the way they looked at the prisoners with horror and pity, and something else, something that looked like shame, though they had nothing to be ashamed of. She wrote about the officer who had cried openly when he saw the pile of bodies near the crematorium. She wrote about freedom, though the word felt foreign on the page, a word from another language she had once spoken but could barely remember. Around her, other women were writing their own impossibilities. A German communist named Liesel, arrested in 1936 for distributing banned pamphlets, wrote to her son, who would now be 19, old enough to have been conscripted, old enough to have fought, perhaps, for the very regime that had stolen his mother. She wrote carefully, afraid of what she might learn, more afraid of learning nothing at all. A Jehovah's Witness named Anna, imprisoned for refusing to salute the flag or renounce her faith, wrote to her congregation, asking if anyone still remembered her name. A Romani woman whose family had been scattered across 6 different camps wrote to an address that might no longer. But Dachau was different. Dachau was where the machinery of genocide had been perfected, where human beings had been reduced to numbers on charts tracking death rates, calorie intake, labor productivity. The Americans had known, abstractly, that such places existed. Intelligence reports had mentioned them, rumors had circulated. But knowing and seeing were 2 different continents, and watching these skeletal women, these ghosts who weighed 70 pounds and wore striped rags that barely counted as clothing, watching them cry over blank pieces of paper, this was seeing. This was understanding that liberation was not a moment but a process, that freedom could not be handed out like rations, that the damage done here would echo through generations. The captain, whose name was David Miller, and who had 3 daughters back in Ohio, stood near the door and watched Sophia write. He thought about his own daughters, safe in their suburban home, playing hopscotch on sidewalks where the worst danger was a skinned knee. He thought about the letters they wrote him, misspelled, enthusiastic, full of news about school plays and lost teeth and neighborhood dogs. He thought about how he had taken for granted the simple miracle of paper and ink and a postal system that worked, the quiet infrastructure of love that allowed families to stay connected across oceans and war zones. He thought about what it would take to make someone forget that such things were possible. The letters took hours to write. Some women produced only a few sentences, exhausted by the effort of hoping. Others filled page after page, years of silence pouring out in ink that smudged under their tears. The Americans brought more paper when the first supply ran out. They brought pencils for those whose hands shook too badly to control pens. They brought translators, other prisoners who spoke multiple languages, who could help those who had forgotten how to form words in their native tongues after years of being forced to speak only German. And slowly, as the afternoon sun slanted through the barracks windows, a strange transformation occurred. The women began to remember. Not just the horrors, those memories had been burned into them, permanent and inescapable. But the other things, the things that had existed before the camps, the sound of their children's laughter, the smell of their mother's cooking, the weight of their husband's hand. A French woman named Marguerite, arrested for resistance activities in Lyon, wrote to her husband and found herself describing the dress she had worn on their wedding day. Blue silk with pearl buttons, stored now in a trunk somewhere, perhaps still existing in a world that seemed increasingly unreal. She had not thought about that dress in 4 years. The memory had been too painful, too dangerous. But now, with the pen in her hand and Americans standing guard to ensure no SS officer would appear to punish this small act of rebellion, she let herself remember. The dress. The ceremony in the small church. The way her husband had looked at her, like she was the only solid thing in a dissolving world. She wrote, "I am coming home. I do not know when or how, but I am coming home. Keep the dress. I want to wear it again. I want to remember what it feels like to be beautiful." This was what the Germans had tried to take, not just life, though they took plenty of that, but the sense of being worthy of beauty, of celebration, of love. They had tried to reduce these women to the sum of their usefulness, to bodies that could labour until they broke. And here was Marguerite, weighing 80 pounds, her body marked with the evidence of beatings and deprivation and medical experiments she would never speak of, writing about a blue silk dress with pearl buttons. Here was the indestructible core of her humanity, battered but not broken, emerging into light like something planted long ago that had somehow survived the winter. The Americans, watching this, began to understand something about the war they were fighting. They had thought of it in terms of territory conquered, bridges captured, enemy forces neutralized. They had thought of liberation as a military objective, a box to check on the road to Berlin. But this was different. This was about reclaiming the right to be human, to be remembered, to matter. This was about the simple, radical act of writing a letter and believing it might reach someone who loved you. A young corporal from Brooklyn, whose job it had been to photograph the camp for the official record, found he could not photograph this scene. He tried, raised his camera, framed the shot, but lowered it again. Some things, he thought, were too sacred for documentation. Some moments belonged only to the... Was this American efficiency real, or was it just a kinder version of the lies they had been told for years? And more terrifying, what if the letters reached their destinations and no one was there to receive them? What if their families had been killed, had fled, had given up and moved on? What if they wrote into a void that would never answer? These questions could not be spoken aloud, not yet. They were too dangerous. So the women wrote with a kind of desperate faith, the same faith that had kept them alive through selections and disease and starvation, and the daily grinding machinery of the camp. They wrote because writing was an act of resistance against erasure. They wrote because even if the letters never arrived, even if they disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing Europe, the act of writing itself mattered. It was proof that they had existed, that they had loved people who were worth remembering, that their lives had been more than the numbers tattooed on their arms. The Nazi system had tried to reduce them to those numbers. Prisoner 45987, Prisoner 73421, Prisoner 91563. Numbers that corresponded to entries in ledgers, to rations allocated, to work assignments given, to deaths recorded with bureaucratic precision. The numbers were supposed to replace their names, their stories, their stubborn insistence on being individual and irreplaceable. But now, writing their letters, the women were reclaiming their names. I am Zofia Kowalska, and I have a daughter named Anya. I am Liesel Schmidt, and I have a son who I hope has survived this war. I am Marguerite Dubois, and I have a blue silk dress waiting for me. Names, identities, connections, the things that make a life real. In the following days, as the Americans established order in the chaos of liberation, more letters were written, hundreds of them. The soldiers set up a makeshift postal service, boxing the letters carefully, organizing them by destination country, promising, though they could not be certain, that every letter would be sent. They assigned clerks to the task, men who had been processing supply requisitions and troop movements, who now found themselves handling these thin sheets of paper with the reverence usually reserved for religious texts. Because that's what they were, in a sense. They were testaments. One letter, written by a Jewish woman named Rachel, who had survived both Ravensbrück and Dachau, would become famous decades later when her grandson published it in a memoir. She wrote to her sister in Palestine, assuming, hoping, that her sister had made it out before the war, that somewhere in the world one fragment of their family remained. The letter was only 2 paragraphs long, written in Hebrew, the letters shaky but clear. My beloved sister, if you receive this, you will know that I survived. If you do not receive it, I will have survived anyway, and someone else will read these words and know that we existed. Remember our mother's Sabbath candles. Remember how Papa sang off key and made us laugh. Remember that we were loved, and that we loved, and that no one can take that from us, even if they take everything else. I am coming home, or I am not. But either way, remember. Your sister, Rachel. The letter reached Palestine 6 weeks later. Rachel's sister, who had spent 7 years believing her entire family was dead, collapsed when she read it. She would later say that the letter weighed nothing but felt heavier than stone, that she carried it with her every day for the rest of her life, that it became the most valuable thing she owned. When Rachel finally arrived in Palestine 8 months later, skeletal, scarred, but alive, her sister met her at the port, holding that letter like a talisman. But that reunion was still in the future. In the barracks at Dachau, in the hours after liberation, Rachel wrote her letter with no guarantee it would arrive. with no certainty that her sister was even alive to read it. She wrote anyway, because writing was the opposite of erasure, because words on paper were a form of immortality, however fragile. Because even if the letter burned, even if it was lost, even if it was read by strangers who would never know her face or her name, the act of writing it mattered. It was a refusal, a rebellion, a small bright flame lit in the darkness of history. The Americans, for their part, found themselves transformed by what they witnessed. These men, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, and college students who had enlisted with dreams of heroism, had arrived at Dachau believing they were the liberators, the saviors, the army of righteousness sweeping across the freedom to love someone and believe they might love you back. These were not gifts the Americans could give. They were rights that had been stolen, and all the Americans could do was stand guard while the women reclaimed them. Private James Henderson, 19 years old, from a small town in Georgia where he had never met a Jewish person or a communist or anyone who had suffered more than a failed crop season, stood watch outside the barracks and tried to understand what he was feeling. It was not pride, exactly. It was something more complicated, a sense of having witnessed something sacred, something that made all the fear and exhaustion and horror of the past 11 months make sense. He had killed men in France. He had watched his best friend die at the Bulge. He had done things he would never speak of, things that still woke him sweating in the night. But this, standing guard while broken women wrote letters to families they might never see, this felt like the reason. This was what they had been fighting for. Not territory, not victory, but this. The simple right of people to write letters and believe they might be read. Years later, when Henderson was an old man dying of cancer in a VA hospital, his granddaughter would ask him what he remembered most about the war. He would not talk about combat. He would not talk about the battles won or the friends lost. He would talk about the women at Dachau, writing their letters on paper the Americans had given them, crying and writing, writing and crying, filling the barracks with the sound of pen on paper, which he said was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He would say that he spent his whole life trying to be worthy of having witnessed that moment, and that he was not sure he ever succeeded. In the weeks that followed liberation, as the full scope of the camp system became clear, as journalists arrived with cameras and notebooks, as the world began to understand what had been done in these places, the letters written by female prisoners at Dachau took on a symbolic weight far beyond their individual content. They became evidence, not just of Nazi crimes, but of human resilience. They were proof that people could be starved, beaten, tortured, degraded, dehumanized, and still retain the capacity to love, to hope, to reach out across the void and say, I am here, I existed, I matter. And when they did, they carried with them something more precious than information. They carried presence. They were proof that the person who wrote them had survived the unsurvivable, that love had outlasted hate, that the machinery of genocide had broken against the simple human insistence on connection. One letter, written by a woman named Helene to her daughter in France, would be found 70 years later in an attic in Lyon, preserved in a box of family documents. The daughter, who had been 8 when her mother was arrested and 15 when she returned, had kept it her entire life. When historians interviewed her in 2015, at the age of 82, she could still recite the letter from memory. She said her mother had returned home 6 months after writing it, thin, silent, marked by experiences she would never fully describe. But she had returned, and that letter, written in the first hours of freedom, had been the first proof that return was possible, that the years of silence might end, that the story was not over. She wrote that the Americans gave her chocolate, the daughter said, her voice quiet. She wrote that a soldier cried when he saw her. She wrote that she loved me and had never stopped thinking about me. She wrote that she was coming home. And she did. She kept that promise. But even if she hadn't, even if something had happened between the writing and the arrival, I would have had that letter. I would have known she tried. I would have known she loved me. That matters more than anything. The symbolic power of the letters extended beyond the individual stories. They became emblematic of the difference between the systems that had fought the war. The Nazi regime had built an elaborate bureaucracy of death, had documented every murder with meticulous precision, had created a paper trail of genocide. But they had forbidden the prisoners from creating their own records, their own narratives, their own evidence of having lived. The letters that the Americans encouraged represented a fundamental repudiation of that system. They said, "These people have the right to tell their own stories. Their words matter. Their connections matter. They are not numbers. They are not labor units. They are human beings with families who love them. And that love is not something that can be erased by barbed wire and crematoria." This was not something. They gave out paper because it seemed like the decent thing to do, because the women asked for it, because they could not think of a reason to refuse. But in that simple act, so different from 12 years of systematic refusal, systematic cruelty, systematic erasure, they embodied something about the system they represented. Not American perfection, which did not exist. Not American innocence, which was already stained by Jim Crow laws and internment camps and the genocide of Native Americans. But American possibility. The idea, however imperfectly realized, that people had rights that governments should protect rather than destroy. That communication was a human need as fundamental as food or shelter. That love was not a privilege to be granted or denied, but a force that existed regardless of what bureaucrats decreed. The women who wrote those letters understood this instinctively. Many of them had been political prisoners, had been arrested precisely for believing in democracy, in freedom of speech, in the value of individual rights against state power. They had spent years in camps surrounded by the evidence of what happened when those values were abandoned, when efficiency replaced ethics, when order became more important than humanity. And now here were these Americans, these strange men with their sloppy salutes and their casual informality, these soldiers who treated the prisoners like people rather than problems, offering them paper and promising that what they wrote would matter. It was, in its way, a form of propaganda more powerful than any poster or radio broadcast. It said, "This is what the other side looks like. This is what we are fighting for. Not just territory or resources or national pride, but the right of a woman to write a letter to her daughter and believe it will arrive. The right to say your name. The right to love someone and tell them so. The right to be remembered." In the decades after the war, as survivors aged and memory became a battleground, as deniers tried to claim the Holocaust had never happened or had been exaggerated, the letters written in those first days of liberation took on yet another significance. They became primary documents, evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. Here were words written by women who had been there, who had survived, who had put pen to paper in the immediate aftermath and recorded what they had experienced. Here were visitors can request to see it, a single sheet of paper, the ink faded now but still legible, the handwriting shaky but determined. The letter is 3 pages long, front and back, filled with 7 years of silence trying to become sound. It is one of the museum's most requested documents, read by students and scholars and survivors, by people trying to understand what happened, by people trying to ensure it never happens again. The museum also holds hundreds of other letters written by female prisoners in the days after liberation, from Dachau, from Bergen-Belsen, from Mauthausen, from all the places where American soldiers arrived and offered paper and ink, and the revolutionary promise that words might reach their intended readers. Together, these letters form a chorus of voices, a testimony that cannot be silenced. They speak of suffering, yes, but also of endurance, of love that survived hatred, of hope that outlasted despair, of the stubborn human refusal to be erased. What the female prisoners experienced when the Americans allowed them to write letters home was not just relief, though they felt relief. It was not just gratitude, though they felt that too. It was a kind of resurrection. They had been living in a state of social death, cut off from the world, treated as if they had ceased to exist, reduced to numbers and labour, and bodies without stories. The letters brought them back to life. Not physically, that would take months of food and medical care and time, but symbolically, spiritually. The letters said, "You are not dead. You are not forgotten. You are not alone." This was the gift the Americans gave, perhaps without fully understanding its magnitude. Not freedom exactly. Freedom would take longer to reclaim, would require more than the opening of gates. But the possibility of freedom. The first small step back into a world where they were people with names and histories and connections that mattered. Where their words had weight. Where someone, somewhere, might be waiting to hear from them. For many of the women, this was more disorienting than liberation itself. They had spent years learning how to survive in a world where nothing they said or did mattered, where the only goal was to become invisible, to avoid notice, to make it through another day. Suddenly they were expected to have. The silence had gone too deep, had carved out something essential. They handed the paper back unused, apologizing in whispers, retreating into the numbness that had kept them alive. The Americans did not push. They understood, or tried to understand, that healing could not be forced, that some wounds went too deep for quick remedy. But most did write. Most found something to say, even if it was only, "I am alive." Even if it was only a name and a date and a location. Even if it was only the barest thread of connection, thin as spider silk, stretched across the impossible distance between the camps and home. They wrote because writing was an act of faith, because faith, however fragile, was the only alternative to despair. The story of the letters written at Dachau is not a story of American heroism, exactly, though there was heroism in what those soldiers did. It is not a story of military victory, though victory was part of it. It is a story about what it means to be human, about the fundamental human need to be seen and known and remembered. It is a story about how democracy, real democracy, not the word but the practice, manifests in the small gestures. Paper and ink, the promise that your words will be taken seriously, the assurance that you have the right to speak, and someone has the obligation to listen. The women who wrote those letters understood this in their bones. They had lived under a system that denied those rights absolutely, that turned people into raw material for the state machine. They knew what it cost to be voiceless, and so when the Americans offered them paper, they saw it for what it was, not just a practical tool for communication, but a symbol of everything they had been fighting to preserve. The right to exist as individuals, the right to love and be loved, the right to say, "I am here," and have someone respond, "I hear you." This is what America represented in that moment, at its best. Not perfection, not innocence, but the possibility that systems could serve people rather than consuming them, that bureaucracy could facilitate connection rather than preventing it, that power could be used to protect rather than to destroy. It would not last, this moment of clarity. The Cold War would complicate the narrative. American hypocrisy would become impossible to ignore. The military-industrial complex would grow into its own form. Here were soldiers who had come to liberate, and here were prisoners taking back their humanity, one word at a time, and the simple exchange of paper for voice felt like what the entire war had been about. 75 years later, the last of those women are dying. The generation that wrote letters home from hell is leaving the world, taking with them first-hand testimony that can never be replaced. But the letters remain. In archives and museums, in family collections and historical records, in the memories of children and grandchildren who grew up hearing stories about the day grandmother was allowed to write home, about the American soldiers who stood guard while broken women remembered how to hope. The letters are fragile now, the paper yellowing, the ink fading, but they endure. They testify. They say, "This happened. We were there. We survived. We wrote our names in our own hand and sent them out into a world that had tried to forget we existed. and someone received them. Someone remembered. This is the power of the written word. This is why dictators burn books and ban pens and criminalize communication. Because words are dangerous. They create connections that barbed wire cannot sever. They build bridges across chasms. They transform numbers back into names, statistics back into stories, abstractions back into human beings who matter. The women who wrote letters home from Dachau in April 1945 were engaging in an act of resistance as powerful as any armed revolt. They were saying, "You tried to erase us, but here we are. You tried to make us disappear, but we are writing ourselves back into existence. You tried to cut us off from everyone we loved, but love survived anyway, and we are proving it with ink on paper, with words that will outlast your regime, with stories that will be told long after your 1,000-year Reich has crumbled into dust." They were right. The Reich fell. The camps were liberated. The guards were prosecuted or fled or died. The machinery of genocide was dismantled, studied, memorialized. And the letters, those small, fragile sheets of paper, written with shaking hands by women who weighed less than their own children, who had every reason to believe that hope was a luxury they could not afford, those letters survived. They are still here. They are still speaking. They are still testimony, not just to the horror of the camps, though they witnessed that in full measure, but to the resilience of the human spirit. To the power of love to endure unendurable circumstances, to the stubborn refusal of people to be reduced to categories, to numbers, to objects to be managed or destroyed. When historians write about the liberation of the concentration camps, they focus on the military operations, the commanders and strategies, the politics and diplomacy. They document the death toll and the infrastructure of genocide. But the true measure of liberation is not found in military reports or policy papers. It is found in those letters, in the shaking hands that held pens, in the tears that smudged ink, in the words that travelled from hell to home and said simply, "I am here. I survived. I still love you. Remember me." This is what the Americans allowed when they offered paper to the female prisoners at Dachau. They allowed the reconstruction of the world. They allowed the reassembly of human connection that the Nazis had tried so hard to shatter. They allowed women to say their names and claim their stories and refuse the erasure that had been imposed on them for years. It was a small thing, paper and ink, but small things in the right context can change everything. They can be the difference between dying forgotten and being remembered. They can be the difference between despair and hope. They can be the difference between being a number and being a person, with a name, a history, a future. The women understood this. The Americans, young and horrified and trying to help, perhaps did not fully understand what they were offering. But they offered it anyway. And in that offering, in that simple moment of decency, extended to people who had been taught that decency no longer existed, something profound occurred. The machinery of death began to reverse itself. The silenced began to speak. The erased began to reappear. The world, broken and bleeding, began the long, slow work of becoming whole. The letters were the beginning, just the beginning. But they were a beginning, and sometimes when everything has been taken, when you have been reduced to nothing, when you stand in the ruins of your life and wonder if there is any point to continuing, sometimes a begin. This was the lesson of the letters. This was what the women taught the Americans, though they did not know they were teaching it. That humanity is not a state that can be achieved or lost, but a practice that must be performed again and again, in small acts of connection and recognition and care. That dignity is not granted by systems, but claimed by individuals, one word at a time. That memory is a form of resistance, and testimony is a weapon against erasure. And love, stubborn, irrational, indestructible love, is the force that holds the world together when everything else falls apart. The women who wrote letters home from Dachau in April 1945 understood this, and in understanding it, in living it, in writing it down so that we could read it 75 years later, they won. Not the war, which armies won, but the larger battle. The battle for meaning, for memory, for the right to say I existed and I mattered, and I loved people who loved me back. That battle they won absolutely, and their victory endures.